Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's very good to be here, to see so many familiar faces, new faces, to listen to some extremely engaging talks, to learn and to discuss and to grow. So I'm talking about a very specific art movement that pretty much took place in Cairo and had ramifications in the countries around Egypt, but also beyond what we call the Middle East during the 30s and the 40s. And their name was the Art and Liberty Group, and they were founded in 1939 by an artist and intellectual, a writer, and other figures. His name is Georges Hnain, and we're seeing an artwork by him that is actually of the sister of another famous artist who was also associated with the group, Inji Eflatun. I would like to focus on two things in my talk. I would like to basically talk about how one of the main mandates of the Art and Liberty Group was to create a moment of dissent, to create a critique of the local status quo as far as, the local artistic practices and the exhibition structures that were at play within Cairo in the 30s and the 40s, and how through doing that they were trying to create a form of rupture that was rebelling against the alignment of art and nationalism. So they were trying to create a form of universal language, borrowing from so many different places to say artists should not be aligned specifically with a nationalist project or a national identity. So to acquaint ourselves a little bit with the work of these artists, I'll start here with another artist, Ramses Yunan, just to give you a little visual introduction for those of you who are not familiar with these artists. Samir Rafa, Kamel Al-Tilmisani. These were all leading figures in that movement. Fuad Kamel. And most of the works that we're looking at here are from the 30s, from the mid-30s to the mid-40s. Ida Carr. Lee Miller. Some of you might think, what is Lee Miller doing in Egypt in the 30s? For those of you who don't know, she left her husband, she left her partner at the time, and she married an Egyptian who was named Aziz Helmi Basha, who was a merchant. So she went to Egypt and spent a few years there, and she was very much working closely with some of the artists that were exhibiting with the Art and Liberty Group. Amy Nimmer, another pioneering artist from the 30s. Kamel Al-Tilmisani again, Marcel Laurent Salinas, and you will see from the names that the artists were not only Egyptian. There were a group of international artists who were living and working in Cairo. Some of them were, half Egyptian, half Italian. Some of them were from Alexandria. Some of them were French or Hungarian, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, at least secularly. So it was a very eclectic and heterogeneous group of artists that were kind of working together. Ibrahim Masouda, Salim Al-Habashi. And while the group was working in Cairo, they were very much connected and aware of so many things that were happening elsewhere. So the story, in a sense, brings us again to the Haus der Kunst. In 1938, they wrote a manifesto in which they condemned the persecution of artists in Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. And they quoted a lot of names that are very known to all of us, and they were kind of offering them a place of refuge. If you need to find a place where you can express yourselves freely, come to Cairo and, have a carte blanche. You can do whatever you want here because we don't have this totalitarian kind of regime and this authoritarian government that is classifying us as degenerate and as great art. So that was in response to the wave of degenerate art, to the kind of rise of nationalism and its kind of coercion of art and artists into mouthpieces for the propagation of a political agenda. That was the response that was coming from Cairo. And in a sense, the reason why we consider the Art and Liberty Group a manifestation of surrealism is not necessarily, as you saw in the images that I showed you, because they were strictly working in a surrealist style as we have come to understand it because of its European manifestation. They were equally interested in the leftist, communist kind of flirtation that surrealism had with communism and leftist kind of inclinations in order to create a political change within the country and within Egypt. And that was kind of manifested in two main lines, in two main trajectories. So they were doing something with the exhibition structure itself, and we will see in particular with the 1941 exhibition that they had. And then they were also trying to challenge the local canon in order to liberate the artists who were working in the country from being, coerced into mouthpieces of a national identity. So just to give you an idea, the first annual Salon du Caire took place in 1909, pretty early on. And it was a very festive event where all the, the monarch, all the government officials would come to open the exhibition, and it was very much salon-style hanging. And in one of the reviews of one of the exhibitions in 1927, I thought it's interesting to kind of give you an idea. His Majesty the King inaugurated last week the annual Egyptian exhibition of the Friends of the Arts, of Fine Arts Society at Tujran Pasha Palace. And this would be the second exhibition of this kind that the society holds, and it has distinguished itself from the one that preceded it by the profusion of its exhibits, which have reached 662 pieces with an abundance of precision and dexterity of its artists who are of different races, nationalities, with many Egyptians amongst them, and so on. So there was a thriving art scene, and there was a certain hegemony that the monarchy, that the government had on the manifestation of these exhibitions. They had to happen in places that were of a certain prestige. They were kind of always associated with some sort of political or governmental presence. And these are just some images of some of these exhibitions. Now, unlike what was happening within the kind of institutionalized exhibition milieu, the Art and Liberty Group chose to exhibit in places that were not aligned or part of that kind of circle. So they had 5 seminal exhibitions between 1940 and 1945. And the first one took place in like a department store building called the Nile Pasha. So you always see the building in its original context and what the building or the location looks like now. So that's the first show that they had in 1940. Then the second show, which I'm going to go back to, took place in an unfinished construction site in the first skyscraper that went up in Egypt. So it was really a very raw space, quite experimental, called the Immobilia building in 1941. Then you have another exhibition that they did in one of the halls of a hotel. And it's interesting to compare what these buildings and what the city looked like back then and what has happened to Cairo in the meantime. And then the last 2 exhibitions took place in the Lycée Français, and unfortunately during the latest events that we have labeled the Arab Spring, the building has been kind of destroyed, and you see that this is where it is now. So this is where the exhibition happened, the last 2 exhibitions that they did in 1944 and 1945. Now, to go back to the second exhibition, there was something very, very interesting that they did. First of all, they laid out the art in the shape of a maze. They actually had some of the artworks covered with fabrics. There were performers doing dance and music within the exhibition, so there was performance art. I still haven't been able to track all the pictures. Most of the information is coming from either reviews or first-hand accounts from the personal, accounts or the manuscripts from the families of the artists. And the exhibition kind of created quite a buzz. There was a lot of controversy. A lot of conservative critics and art aficionados were totally against it. They thought it was totally disrespectful, very, very almost obscene and destructive. And they started calling it degenerate art in Cairo, which is very interesting. And there was a very interesting dialogue going place about what is degenerate art and what is not degenerate art in the daily and weekly papers in Cairo at the time. So these are just some images of some of the artworks by the same artists whom I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. A lot of these artworks, are still to be relocated, and this is something that I'm working on. So there was a lot of controversy, and one of the artists, the main protagonist, George Hnain, created an installation with a mannequin, and it was called Bad Business Alley. And I think for those of you who are familiar with the history of surrealism, mannequins ring a bell. And there is something very interesting with this particular exhibition that takes us, in a sense, to the 1938 exhibition that took place in Paris at the Galerie Beaux-Arts, which was run by the Wildensteins, where Duchamp was the curator and all the artists created mannequins. There was performance, there was dance. And the question that one asks is, how aware were the surrealists in Cairo of what the surrealists in Paris or in Mexico were doing? Well, the name Art and Liberty Group is an interesting dialogue with the Fiari that was happening in Mexico with Diego Rivera, you know, and Trotsky. But then there are other interesting things that one starts looking at, and this takes us even a little bit further back to the colonial exhibitions that used to happen in Paris. A lot of these artists were Francophone and used to spend a lot of time in Paris. But then to another exhibition that took place in 1931 that was a response to the Exposition Internationale Coloniale, which was the Exposition sur la vérité de colonie, the exhibition that was about the truth of the colonies, that was organized by Thirion, one of the communists, a member of the Communist Party in Paris, but also Yves Tanguy was one of the organizers. And they did something very interesting. They were using European kind of statues of Madonnas, they were using artifacts and presenting them as primitive objects brought from the colonies. So they were reversing the equation in the same way that France in the colonial exhibition would show artifacts and art objects coming from the colonies, you know, as a means of showcasing the culture of the other. They reversed the equation and showed their own culture, in a sense, as a primitive object. And we're all aware with the hybridized object of Man Ray, you know, other artists were doing the same thing, and so did E. Dakar by kind of mixing a pharaonic head with a doll and kind of playing with a notion of anti-nationalism. Egyptian pharaonism was very, very much at play at the time. A lot of artists were using images of ancient Egypt to create a sense of Egyptian national identity. The surrealists here were doing something completely different. They were using it in a playful way, not at all to propagate a sense of national pride. They were more interested in the notion of the hybridized object, similar to what other artists were doing in other parts of the world. So they were aware there was a dialogue, and there were many pointers to this dialogue. Breton and Hnain had met in 1936. Breton was one of the signatories of the a manifesto or declaration against the way, you know, the communists were working against Trotsky. So he was one of the signatories of this proclamation. And the manifesto itself was published in France, and it was read by a lot of people. Yves Tanguy was also one of the signatories of the proclamation that Hnain signed, so they were having a lot of discussions. We don't have more information about how aware they were of the tactics that the surrealists were using in Paris or in their anti-colonial exhibitions, but we know that there was a very, very in-depth dialogue and back and forth going on over a long period of time. So, in a sense, they used all these tactics in order to create a format of exhibitions that was not aligning itself with the more traditional conservative bourgeois type of exhibitions that was taking place usually in Cairo at the time. So that was one of the ways through which they were adopting, negotiating what other surrealists were doing in order to create a structure of an exhibition that was kind of separating itself or creating a moment, a descent basically from the confounding of nationalism and art through the exhibition structure. Then they were doing other things in order to challenge the local canon, and I'll give you one example with which I will finish. Some of you might be familiar with a very prominent early modernist sculptor from Egypt called Mahmoud Mukhtar, who went to Paris in 1911 after graduating from the Fine Arts School in Cairo. And according to the art history that has been written mostly by Egyptians, he was the first student to study at the Académie des Beaux-Arts in Paris. When I went there and did the research, it turns out he was never admitted to the school. As a matter of fact, he never applied. He went and studied under Coutan, and it was a common practice to study under one of the professors teaching at the school in order to prepare for the entrance exams, but he never did. However, it was very convenient from a nationalist perspective to coin him or to present him as the first Egyptian artist to study at the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts, and that stuck. Until now, we hear a lot of presentations about him, and that's what everybody says, although it was not accurate. However, that doesn't mean that he wasn't a brilliant sculptor who was negotiating his own Egyptian heritage and movements in modernist sculpture at the time. So here you see two beautiful examples that were both presented in Paris in 1930. And here there's an interesting example of a monumental sculpture that he did in 1928. It was revealed, it was inaugurated in 1928, and it still stands outside the Cairo Zoo in Giza, called Egypt Awakening. It's a great sculpture showing a woman, an Egyptian woman, lifting her veil and leaning on a rising sphinx in order to move forward. So he was totally aligned with this kind of image of nationalism and using Pharaonism in a new way to create an image for the nation. Now, the Surrealists were, and you can see how prominent he was. You know, there were actors, you know, reenacting the sculpture. You can see how one of the textile brands used the image of the sculpture as their logo. I mean, it was going viral, basically. And the so-called Surrealist Art and Liberty group were not very happy with that. He was, for them, the epitome of the artist who becomes basically a servant for nationalism. So they were, and they were trying to go against that with everything that they were doing. So in one of their seminal journals that only had 7 issues because it was banned in 1940, in the second one, they talk about his art. We saw an image of this work. And they say how deplorable it is that a lot of younger artists feel that they have to live up to this artist because he's so famous. And how nationalism becomes a way of framing and enslaving artists instead of allowing them the freedom to open up and choose any artistic style, any artistic language that they feel kind of resonates with them. So you can see how they were challenging the local canon as well, not only by dismantling the traditional exhibition structure, but by writing and critiquing, the esteemed, established artists that were aligned with the system. Another important artist who was also from the pioneering generation, called Mahmoud Saeed, was the only artist that they liked, and they invited him to exhibit with them twice. And you can see why they thought his work was very different. There was something very menacing, haunting, sexual. The imagery that he uses is very distinct. It has roots in the local traditional vernacular, but it also makes use of, different styles of painting. And he was one of the few artists from the older established artists that they invited to work with them. Another way through which they were challenging the canon is the way they were writing about artists. So this is the catalog of their second exhibition that I was talking about before. And you can see how they refer to the artists. There's no mention of nationality. There's no mention of the land, the motherland, or the ancient historical image of a nation. They talk about how artists like color, how artists, feel compelled to use a certain style. They talk about the way artists approach the canvas or create brushstrokes. It's very much about what the artist is doing artistically, semantically, formalistically, rather than coining them or framing them within a certain national identity. So, in a sense, I just wanted to introduce you. There's so much to talk about when it comes to this movement, and it was just a little survey specifically on one exhibition that they did. And I will finish with a little anecdote. In 2008, there's this kind of festival that is called Photo Cairo. And in the edition of 2008, 2009, the curators wanted to do something where, they use spaces that are not part of the official system. Because until now, most of the spaces in Cairo that are not, there are now a few independent spaces, but until very recently, most of the spaces are kind of sponsored or run by the government. So they went around and they looked for places, and one of the places where they used was the Immobilia building. That same building that was unfinished, when the Art and Liberty group did their second exhibition in 1941. And when I went to see the show, I was so intrigued to see if they were going to make any commentary, because this is what happened in that same space, 70 years ago or so. And unfortunately, there was no mention at all, no recognition, no knowledge whatsoever about what the Art and Liberty Group did for the same purpose so many years before those artists and those curators did in that year. And in a sense, this is kind of a way to reflect on how do we as curators and as art scholars and as artists look at our own history. I mean, it's very easy to look at the other and kind of think, how did the other frame us? How did the other take away something from us? But also, there are times when we ourselves do not recognize our own history and our own achievements and what we have done in dialogue with that other, you know, or the imagined other sometimes. So for me, that was an interesting wake-up call to always not connect on a transversal level, but also try to find a new framework for the way, as a curator, I try to present contemporary art from a certain part of the world. Not only to compare with what's happening now in other places, but also dig down and try to create a vertical line that creates a new framework through which we can appreciate the achievements of artists working today. So that's all I have to say about the Art and Liberty Group. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Haus der Kunst, for the invitation, Atri, for arranging this wonderful get-together and exchange of ideas, and for all of you who are still here. It's kind of interesting that I would speak about Iraq right after Sam just spoke about Egypt. And because Iraq and Egypt sort of, have the longest art history within the so-called Arab world in the region, but a very, very different history. Cairo had the first College of Fine Art in 1908, Iraq not until the 1940s. And so Sam could talk about, the Art and Liberty Group sort of, challenging the kind of canon that was established in Egypt. Well, in Iraq, in the 1930s, I think it was 1936, was the first time there was an exhibition of modern Iraqi art. And we know about it, it was an industrial, actually, exhibition, and we know about it from a letter that Gertrude Bell has written to, I can't remember who exactly, I'm sorry, where she talks about this tent that they pitched and the sort of, the Iraqi artist, it was good of them to try, although their art was very ugly, but it was a good attempt on their behalf to start something, exhibiting Iraqi art. So, okay. This is a good place, but I can't see my paper, okay. The Modern Thought, published in the late 1940s, was a journal launched and edited by the Iraqi artist Jamil Hamoudi that covered all aspects of international contemporary arts, both visual and literary. The image of the cover of the 4th issue was published sometime after 1948, we don't have an exact date on the issue itself, is by Iraq's best-known artist Jawad Salim. It is a sketch of the statue commissioned by the Baghdad municipality that Salim designed and built for the Directorate of Public Transportation. Salim's intention, as argued by Hamoudi, was to convey the concept of transportation through his design, which clearly exhibits elements of the Assyrian tradition. End of quote. Hamoudi further explained that the masculine human form signifies strength and balance. The wing signifies speed, while the Assyrian-looking wheel suggests its origin in Mesopotamia. This statue, which combines speed, power, forward motion, and the history of transportation, embodies Salim's life efforts to construct a modern spirit in the renewal of the Iraqi taste. It was to promote this new method of expression, modern art, that a number of art groups were formed during the 1940s and 50s in Iraq. 3 main extremely active groups, each centered around a noted artist, dominated the scene. Collectively, they exemplified the artist's struggles to carve a socially accepted space for their local and world vision. The first was called the Société Primitive, SP, formed in 1941, and was led by artist Faik Hassan. Let me just put this image. Faik Hassan. They organized 3 exhibitions in 1941, 1943, and the last in 1946. Noted artist Abdelkader Rassam, who was one of Iraq's first art teachers, was an honorary member of the group. And Abdelkader Rassam was an Ottoman officer who was trained in military school, and after the dismantlement of the Ottoman Empire, went back to Baghdad and have taken few topography painting classes in the military school, became one of the first art teachers in Baghdad. The group also organized a number of cultural lectures. Late in 1950, they organized an exhibition in a small house on the Tigris River, which was actually Jawad Salim's house, under a new title, Al-Ruwad, the Pioneers. In the introduction for their 1958 exhibition, Salim wrote, "I worked hard to forget what I have learned. We live in an age surrounded by different styles and influences, and we must know what works for us to keep and to leave the rest. Noble subjects, whether collective, political, or humanitarian, are not enough to make noble and original art. But the artist must be prepared, above all else, to produce them with sincerity. Guernica was not made eternal because it was bombed, but was made eternal through Picasso's work." End of quote. Salim was involved in establishing the second group, along with Shakir Hassan al-Said in 1951, and you're seeing an image of both of these artists. The Baghdad Group of Modern Art, arguably Iraq's most significant art group. Salim perceived it as a necessary step beyond that of Al-Ruwad to introduce a new way of thinking about making art and to fulfill the notion of negotiating both the past and the present. It was the first group that constituted a movement, a school of thought and style, instead of a gathering of artists who shared a philosophy, which the first group and the second group that I'm going to mention now were basically a group of artists that shared a context but not a style. I'll come back to the Baghdad Group of Modern Art in a second. The third was the Impressionist group. Most of the members actually didn't work in Impressionism, but rather experimented with post-Impressionism and Cubist styles. It was formed in 1954 by Iraqi artist Hafiz al-Drubi, and the group established mainly from al-Drubi's college students. Its members included noted artists Diyal al-Zawi, Saad al-Kabi, and Ala Bashir, artists who are very well known today. The three groups together remained constituted of about 50 painters and sculptors who, while sometimes acting collectively, remained very active individually. With the return of students from abroad and the increasing number of graduates from Mahad al-Funun al-Jamila, the Fine Arts Institute, and the Academy of the Art Academy, Academiyat al-Funun al-Jamila. Both the institute was established in 1941, and then the Academy in 1946. Art groups multiplied in the 1960s. Jabra Ibrahim Jabra, Iraq's preeminent art critic, himself a poet, a novelist, and an artist, wrote, "From the beginnings of the 1950s, Iraqi art achieved a unique status in a very challenging field." End of quote. While acknowledging the numerous creative directions into which European art was continuously heading and the strong relation between its formal and technological developments, Jabra praised Iraqi art on the same level as that of any developed country, on the basis of the essential relations between an individual and his or her creativity and the materiality of artwork. Jabra also noted that aside from providing young artists with art scholarships to study abroad, Iraq as a state officially began to acknowledge and value its artists during the 1950s. The state organized the first comprehensive exhibition of Iraqi art at Al-Mansour Club in February 1956. Jabra argued that the sweeping success of the exhibition, during which the government bestowed artists with rewards for excellence, motivated the establishment of the Association of Iraqi Artists, an association that is still active till today. One could clearly see the connection between the activities of the first two groups of artists that led to this recognition, but more specifically, that of the Baghdad Group of Modern Art, Jama'at Baghdad lil-Fann al-Hadith, on which I will now focus. Jawad Salim perceived the years of World War II and its immediate post as the beginning of a pivotal shift that marked a unique Iraqi engagement with modernism. The political tension and local unrest between the pro-allies, as per the 1930 British-Iraqi treaty, and the pan-Arabs, the pro-Axis actually group, brought about a rude awakening for artists. The Baghdad Group of Modern Art was formed to begin a necessary negotiation between a new post-colonial national consciousness and a European, albeit perceived as international and transnational, modernism. The poet Fadl al-Azawi attributes Iraq's engagement in modernism to a historic confluence of global and local conditions. It was a confluence that would be very difficult to locate in any other Arab country, he argued. In statements written by Iraqi artists from the 1940s to the 1960s, and in their memoirs, one is immediately struck by the distinct comfort they felt in moving across and within various borders. Operating within truly global parameters, artists aimed at bridging the gap between self and other. Baghdad was a cultural hub, where reading Hegel and listening to Puccini, Iraqi intellectuals equally enjoyed listening to Iraqi Maqam, Kulthum, or reading Taha Hussein. Nevertheless, and I have more images of the groups. Nevertheless, subjects of work created before the 1950s had directly appealed to Iraqis. They were images of deserts by Faik Hassan, working people and peasants by Jawad Salim, nature in Ata Sabri's work, and I apologize, I didn't think I should show you these images, although now I realize you probably don't know these artists. In the absence of a modern tradition of representation, Iraqis were shocked to see familiar aspects of their lives on canvas. At the same time, Iraqi artists realized that they were still stuck in the 19th century European styles. Instrumental in this realization, artists tell us, were the Poles, as they referred to them in the writing of the period. On September 9, 1943, Salim, in his journal, wrote, "Then there was the war. A few of them, meaning Polish artists, were transferred to Baghdad. They attended our annual exhibition and met me and Faik Hassan in 1941. It was a very passionate meeting when they learned that we were part of the School of Paris as well." And he tells us later that these students, the Polish artists, had studied with Pierre Bonnard 20 years earlier. He says, "I learned about the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists from them. I learned the value of time and color, and so on." The importance of these Polish artists is in the fact that they gave Salim and other Iraqi artists the opportunity to discuss ideas and new experiments beyond the academic styles in Iraq itself. Artist Ismail Sheikhli, who was a third-year student at the Institute of Fine Arts then, recalls that following several meetings with the Polish artist, his teacher, artist Faik Hassan, noted artist Faik Hassan, asked the class to tear apart all that they have painted thus far, calling it shallow, and changed his teaching methods to include discussing all these new ideas that were introduced by the Polish artist. Thus, the Polish artists provided a Western art historical education that was missing from their curriculum, particularly as they preceded the major scholarships to Europe and motivated Iraqi artists to rebel against the academic style. Salim's first scholarship to study art in 1938 in Paris was abruptly terminated in less than a year with the beginning of World War II. He was sent to Rome instead, but the war soon followed. So he had to return to Baghdad and was appointed an instructor at the Institute of Fine Arts. His period abroad was short, but served as an introduction to various concepts, particularly to the notion of experimentation. Critic Abdel Rahman Munif considers it as a decisive period during which Salim's priorities were formed in terms of influences and styles. He argues that given its short duration, his return to Baghdad and teaching at the Institute before his further travel made him more mature and exposed him to multiple influences without one school or approach becoming dominant. Particularly as Baghdad at that time reflected the political, social, and intellectual turmoil of the period. It was a time of challenging the status quo on every level. Thus, artists and critics, Polish and British, passing by or stationed in Baghdad during the war years acted as a supplement to his education, Salim and the other artists. After the end of the war, Salim was sent to England to study at the Slade School, where he met his wife, Lorna, and both returned to Iraq in 1949. In Baghdad, Salim was part of a wider conversation that included challenges in poetry, architecture, and theater. The 1950s is also when, for example, architects like Walter Gropius went to Baghdad, and in fact, the design of the administration of the Baghdad University is by Gropius. It's the decade when the plans for what became the Olympic sports building were bought from Le Corbusier. So it was a very sort of international, cosmopolitan, as fraught a term as that is, in Iraq as well. The first meeting for the Baghdad Group of Modern Art, actually, let me not do that yet. The first meeting for the Baghdad Group of Modern Art took place in April 1951 in Jawad Salim's house and was attended by his sister, Naziha Salim, his wife, Lorna Salim, his brother, Nazar Salim. He actually comes from a family of artists. His father was an artist, all of his brothers, and one sister. Shakir Hassan al-Said, Muhammad Ghani Hikmat, who was also a sculptor. And this is a very important point because sculptors were very rare in Iraq in general. And so, to actually have Jawad Salim as a sculptor and then, have other sculptors join the group was a very important factor. There was no history or precedent for sculpture in Baghdad. To look actually, and I'm struck by the fact that I have only 5 minutes, I just started. As the leader of the group, Salim emphasized and promoted the notion of istilham al-turath, which translates to seeking inspiration. Actually, I can't find an exact translation for it, but the best thing is seeking inspiration or motivation from tradition. And developed an artistic vision which was equally historiocultural and modern. Istilham is a concept that advocates, mediation between the past and present, a form of a negotiation of heritage and tradition to project forward and realize a new contemporary aesthetic. It was perceived as a spiritual relationship between the past and present, regardless of the temporal distance. In the inaugural speech delivered on their first collective exhibition in 1951, the group declared, "We dream that there is a dream that connects us with all the beings that simply dream, a dream we call Baghdad." Now, Baghdad becomes a very significant term, not only because of the city of Baghdad, but because of the 13th century Baghdad School of Painting that was discovered by the Iraqi artist. Now, to just sort of show you the difference between, for example, the two artists, leading artists of the time, this is the work of Faiq Hassan, which was sort of very passionate and emotional, and through which he was trying to negotiate the Iraqi characteristics, the Iraqi personalities. The group of those, the Baghdad Group of Modern Art, did not see or perceive actually a tension between what became sort of an official position at first of the government, as particularly after the 1958 revolution, which to them was a sort of a revolutionary moment of continuation, between the arts as well, and a sort of a decade of possibilities. And the work of Jawad Salim. Jawad Salim, the man and artist, actually is sort of an obsession for anyone who works on Iraqi art, to the point that sometimes impossible to move beyond it. He was a dandy man. He loved poetry. He loved theater. He loved the arts in general. He played the guitar. He kind of participated in creating the new citizen for Iraqi, a new model for the Iraqi citizen. But he was also an activist, a cultural agent who professed as his duty to exact change. His wife Lorna writes that he tried to define in artistic terms the emerging national aspirations of his country, and in that his work undoubtedly reflects the feeling of the time. He set out to prove that they could be proud of their ancient heritage and did not need to feel inferior to anyone. End of quote. He was a modernist artist whose experimentations in form and content did not stop until his death. And I'm kind of quickly going to go through some of the images. And Jawad Salim's work sort of fluctuated between the local and the global. Local, he had a series called the BARDAOUIL, which sort of had sort of three major groups, but through which he actually focused on the urban fabric of Baghdad. He articulated modern life, depicting scenes of street life, nomadic, in domestic intimacy. And the global, transnational themes like motherhood, or for example, the political prisoner. And this is actually his submission for, and he was one of the 86 works that were awarded prizes in the worldwide sculpture competition, The Unknown Political Prisoner, that was organized by the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London in 1952 and exhibited at the Tate. The competition was designed, and I quote, to pay tribute to those individuals who, in many countries and in diverse political situations, had dared to offer their liberty and their lives for the cause of the human freedom, end of quote. It was Reg Butler who won the first prize. Essential in Salim's, and you can see actually some of Salim's earlier 1940s work and how it changed after, in the 50s when he formed the Baghdad Group of Modern Art. In naming the 1950s Baghdadiyat, Salim referenced the Abbasid Baghdad School of Painting, for those of you who from Maqamat al-Hariri, Yahya al-Wasiti's work, which they had discovered in Paris, and which became sort of the goal of renewal in art for them. So Baghdadiyat at once forges a historical continuity and expresses the contemporaneity of his expression. They consisted of three groups of painting, one having its sources in folk life and tradition, second in vernacular artifacts, and the third in the children's innocence of joy. But they are also dubbed hilaliyat, crescent shapes. And you can see the crescent shape, which sort of becomes a pattern, and that also references this sort of Islamic manuscripts or Islamic ornamentation, as well as, a sort of a modern pattern. There's a high contrast between shapes, that's something, a duality that always existed in his work. This combines the hilaliyat, the crescent shape, and the theme of motherhood. So this sort of, the circular, which is the feminine in ancient Mesopotamia, but it's the womb, and so it's the feminine, and then, the child, in this case here, is the egg. And the last work of, that he started, and Jawad Salim died very young. He died before he finished this mural, which is the first public, actually, monument by an Iraqi artist in Iraq, and ironically still stands today through all the wars and the successive governments. And it is the Nasb al-Hurriya, the Monument of Freedom. He died before he finished it, so several artists, other sculptors finished his work. He sort of towards, couple of years before he died, he stopped painting and he focused on sculpture again. He couldn't fluctuate between the two, it was one or the other. And these are some of the, there are discussions of how to read this from right to left, from left to right, or from the middle sort of outward. Clearly, it reads in almost like a register, Mesopotamian register or Arabic letters, but also one can see various other negotiations in the work. But to show you sort of, and again, the distinction between his work and Faiq Hassan, Iraq's other sort of very famous and well-noted artist, who was a lot more sort of emotional. Jawad Salim was a passionate man, but he was an intellectual artist. His work was based on intellectualizing folk art, intellectualizing the mundane. But it was also, it made it very accessible for people to, for the Iraqi society to connect with. I must say that, the new government after 1958 and the Monument of Freedom was commissioned by the military, the new military government of Abdul Karim Qasim. But Jawad Salim succeeded in having no direct reference to that revolution of the 1958, which I think is the reason why that sculpture still stands there, and making it sort of a more trans-Iraqi monument. But people in Iraq and the Ministry of Culture sort of facilitated that connection between the people and the artist by organizing exhibitions, by patroning the art. It was a dictatorship from the beginning, but that dictatorship sort of understood the value of the art, and artists actually knew how to use it. One very important thing I'm going to mention before I leave the podium is that Baghdadiyat were happening in the 1950s, which is sort of always referred to as the golden age or the golden decade of Iraq, the prosperous decade. But the reality is Jawad Salim was painting these works, these street scenes of Baghdad at a time of high turbulence. It was during actually the reign of the prime minister, there were so many coups. The prime minister, Nur Said, has enforced emergency law. There were no demonstrations allowed. There was corruption. There were inflation. And none of that was reflected in the Baghdadiyat work. In a way, it's the denial of the actual status quo, the reality of what was happening, that makes this work. The rejection makes this work, that moment of creativity that we've been sort of, various groups have been talking about, which actually set a precedent till today. And in the invasion of 2003, media were shocked to not see art of dissent towards Iraq, towards Saddam Hussein or beyond. And it's actually that sort of moment that Jawad Salim invoked that started that trend. Thank you.
The end of the Second World War coincided with the emergence of what I'm calling post-colonial modernism in Africa. Inspired by the wave of post-war decolonization and the attendant rhetoric of political sovereignty, a generation of artists and writers in many parts of Africa used their work to reimagine and recalibrate their relations with Imperial Europe. It's not that they simply rejected Europe or replaced it with native cultures. Rather, in mapping and marking the terrains of their artistic imaginaries, they articulated a compound modernist aesthetic within and through which the complex drama of their post-colonial subjectivities played out. As the drawings of Uche Okeke in Nigeria and Ibrahim El-Salahi, who we heard about through Iftika's presentation 2 days ago, or yesterday, of Sudan, as their drawings and paintings show, what these artists accomplished during the mid-century are new forms in which we see the making of a compound, in other words, messy, fraught, and inevitably distinctive post-colonial modern subjectivities. The first major venue at which the matter of developing an appropriate modernist language for decolonizing Africa was debated and promulgated was the Mbari Artists and Writers Club, established in 1961 in Ibadan, Nigeria, with a founding membership that included some of the leading figures such as the German-born critic Uli Baya, Nigerian writers Wole Soyinka, Chinua Achebe, Christopher Okibo, J.P. Clark, and artists Uche Okeke and Demas Nwoko, but also the South African writer Eskia Mfakhlele and the sculptor Vincent Kofi from Ghana and Ibrahim El-Salahi from the Sudan. So this was a very international group of writers and artists and critics. The intellectual atmosphere at the club, which Achebe named after the Igbo Mbari, that is the sculpture, painting, and architectural complex dedicated to Allah, the earth goddess and guardian of creativity and justice among the Igbo. This scene, this platform was intense, not so much because of the debates on the possibilities of new art, literature, and theater in the new nation and their relationship with African and European traditions. Mbari was also the inaugural site for important conversations on the meaning and form and the appropriate language for what Apadurai called the work of the imagination in post-independent Africa. The members were fully aware that form was not only subjective, but was more importantly ideological, and that to control the power inherent in literary and artistic language, one must necessarily claim the right to determine the conditions of its formal procedures and ultimately how it must be deployed. To them, form, though an important element of style and aesthetics of the image and text, nevertheless constituted a space within which the contestation and articulation of cultural and political subjectivity occurs. For instance, in the work of Chinua Achebe, arguably the most important of the Mbari writers, post-colonial literary modernism meant transforming the English language and prose to reflect the rhythmic quality of Igbo verbal style and oral traditions. As such, the reconstitution and reinvention of English prose through a synthesis of linguistic and literary devices drawn from both Igbo and English languages in the novel Things Fall Apart was Achebe's declaration of his position on the question of form in post-colonial African literature. He, in other words, invented a new form of English, still recognizable to metropolitan Anglophones, yet compellingly familiar to readers versed in the Igbo language, culture, and thought. And that explains the mutual attraction he shared with Okeke, who illustrated the second edition of Things Fall Apart, as we see on the screen, and Ibrahim El-Salahi, two of the 4 visual artists associated with the Mbari Club. In 1958, 2 years before Nigerian political independence from Britain, and 3 years before the Mbari Club, Okeke confronted the problem of modernism and political sovereignty when he co-founded the Art Society, a group of art students based at the Nigerian College of Art, Science and Technology, Zaria. Inspired by the liberatory rhetoric of negritude and Pan-Africanism, particularly the idea that modernity and indigenous cultural heritages must be crucial foundations of progressive society beyond colonialism, Okeke and his colleagues engaged in a systematic appropriation of elements from specific Nigerian and European art forms and procedures. This dynamic relationship between culture and politics and the aesthetic and ethical values attached to them were important to the critical agency of contemporary post-colonial artists. While in college, at the time that he was part of this art society, Okeke's work was inspired by the Fauvist and expressionist painting that he was studying extracurricularly at the time. But he also collected Igbo folklore and conducted research, and this will echo in the work of Salahi. He conducted research on Uli mural and body art, which we see on the screen, and learned drawing techniques within this Uli tradition from his mother, who herself was an accomplished Uli artist. Uli artists draw from an extensive corpus of motifs mostly favoring abstract design elements that are based on organic forms adapted from local flora and fauna or celestial bodies, or motifs made and based on man-made objects. An important aspect of uli drawing technique is the deft handling of the pigment to create elegant lyrical lines and the sensitive balancing of negative and positive space that constitutes the hallmark of the best examples of the art. These formal qualities transformed Okeke's work after college, beginning from the Oja Suite of 1962. Typical of the Oja Suite drawings is From the Forest, depicting a shrub growing along a vertical axis on the left side of the composition, while similar linear forms suggesting a forest background occupy the rest of the picture plane. This image of a tendriliferous flora, as in traditional uli drawing, is defined by crisp, elemental, and spontaneous gestural linear marks, and that this requires acutely coordinated mental process and rapid hand movement is attested to by the effortless manner in which angles, single lines negotiate various paths, at times angular, at times curvilinear. In Head of a Girl, a straight vertical line runs right up on her forehead down to the nostrils, which are merely indicated by a corrugated M or W shape line. This line, broken below the nostrils, ends in the spiral mark representing the mouth. Crossing this vertical line are two horizontal marks marking either the upper eyelid on the left or the eyebrow on the right. As with the mouth, the same spiral motif representing her bundled or curly hair suggests the eyes and pupils in one single gesture. Even the many other short gestural lines tend to end in spirals, as though several autonomous centripetal forces pull the lines towards the center as soon as they emerge. It is as if one imagines the drawing process, the artist's pen was dancing on the paper, leaving the drawing as an index of that activity. This reading is not entirely far-fetched, for Okeke himself has made a connection between the dance and traditional uli drawing, in that both the artist's hand and the dancer's movement are lyrical gestures. This system of representation is most evident in another quite remarkable drawing. Here we initially see vertical lines broken into long and short linear marks. Between some of them are high-density zigzag marks, some of which end in spirals. These are mostly in the lower part of the picture and at the top corners. At the top right area especially, we see bolder marks suggestive of dense foliage. On top of these is a large spiral at the apex of a triangular formation of spirals, 4 of which are placed diagonally on the picture plane. And once we realize that the title of the drawing is Haus, it all begins to make sense. That the two sets of lower spirals and pairs of eyes belonging to two owls, the color knot motif being their vastly exaggerated beaks, and this is what I'm referring to, this motif, which is a fairly triangular motif that comes out of this uli motif system. Whereas in Head of a Girl, the spiral form signifies the hair, eyes, and mouth. In Haus, it signifies bird's eyes and the moon. Thus, with just one graphic gesture, the artist represents human, animal, and cosmic forms. In other words, a conscious decision on Okeke's part to invent new ways of seeing and representing mythic and genre subjects. Indeed, this system of notation continued in the Munich suite, a series of ink and charcoal drawings he produced during a residency at the then Franz Mayer Studios here in Munich between 1962 and 1963. In The Munich Girl, for instance, he extends the polysemic possibilities of the unispiral form in the sense that the girl's left eye might well be a lock of hair hanging down her forehead and ending in a curly bang. Perhaps signifying testifying to the precariousness of this signifying gesture. The viewer has a hard time differentiating between the right eye, the right eye from what might be a long strand of hair that seems to hang over the eye, ending abruptly. So really what he's working through at this time was how to adapt these motifs from traditional uli painting into new ways of representing form. The formal inventiveness of Okeke's 1962 and 63 drawings is the consequence of his rigorous exploitation of Igbo uli art based on a sensibility that comes from his internalization of the experimental approach to image making we have come to associate with 20th century modern art. In other words, like Achebe, Okeke had come to the conclusion in 1962 that post-colonial artistic modernism had to be forged from an effective combination of formal and aesthetic resources mined from the artist's familiarity with Western and inherited Igbo art traditions, a process he had described in a 1960 text as natural synthesis. For Okeke, the choice of synthesis as an operational tactic and rhetorical mode is, on the one hand, a rejection of the prevailing colonial era perception of modern African artists as a sorry product of clashing cultures, and on the other hand, the assertion of his power to negotiate his place within this field of modern art and culture. Their conservative European-style academic training gave way to a search for other ways of developing new work that meaningfully reflected their new status as radically self-aware post-colonial African artists. Indeed, it is precisely to articulate and propel this artistic and literary modernism that was the primary impetus for the establishment of Mbari Artists and Writers Club, and that is what brought El Salahi into the Mbari orbit at this time. El Salahi's 1960s work, like those of his colleagues Mohammed Ibrahim and Osman Wakiala at the College of Fine Arts in Khartoum in the 1960s, shows the continental reach of post-colonial modernism. By the time Salahi left the Sudan for the Slade School of Art in early 1950s, he had already demonstrated an academic-style mastery of mimetic representation. At the Slade, he was exposed to various modernist approaches to image making, and these are some of the works that he was doing, extracurricular work he was doing at this time. From the exacting and rigorously constructed yet restrained naturalism of William Coldstream, whose name came up yesterday, to the post-vorticist styles associated with David Bomberg, who had gone out of fashion at this point in the 50s around the Slade, and various other interpretations of the formal lessons of Cubism, particularly However, he soon confronted the ontological implications of his art training at the Slade, particularly given the total absence in the new aesthetic of anything related to Africa or the Sudan, both of which he increasingly believed constituted the core of his individual subjectivity after his country's independence in 1956. On his return to the Sudan in 1957, Salahi organized an exhibition. We heard about this yesterday, and basically was turned down by the Khartoum audience, more or less. And this eventually led to this crisis, as he describes it, and that's what led to his travels, extensive travels for the next couple of years around the Sudan, studying local traditions, going to West Africa to study the masking traditions there, as a way to rethink what it meant to be a modern artist in decolonized Africa. Salahi began with the inclusion of legible text, and this was, as it says, how he needed to draw his audience to the work through this inclusion of legible text initially, things that his audience could read. In his figurative and narrative compositions, followed by a progressive decomposition and reconstitution of the calligraphic forms, the result of which was an experience, as we heard yesterday, as the opening of a mystical Pandora box with therianthropes and skeletal figures emerging from this process of deconstructing the text. Further sequential deconstructions of the calligraphic forms resulted, for instance, in The Always Appear and The Embryo, The Child and the Bird, in which abstract shapes, ritual scripts, and enigmatic imagery populate the picture surface, thus revealing the extent to which Salahi internalized and reimagined his work at this time. Now, the question then for us is, how do we deal with this sense in which this artist who had trained in the academic tradition and who was fascinated with the work of the European avant-garde, but who at the same time thought it was very important to listen, in other words, to the expectations of his local audience? What kind of modernist subjectivity or artistic subjectivity was he imagining at this time, in which the audience played an important role in the ways that he was fashioning his work as a contemporary artist? And let me note, as a way to end, that the work of Okeke and Salahi and their colleagues at the Mbari Club and in Khartoum was insistently modernist, and I need to end with this emphasis, for it testified to their belief, at least at that point in time, as harbingers of the new, that the artist had a crucial role in fashioning a new art and culture for the new nation and the world. It also shows their attempt to articulate their dynamic and critical relationship with ancestral tradition. And third, to their commitment to inventing unprecedented formal styles. In other words, the political, philosophical, and formal conditions of this work are simultaneously post-colonial and modernist, and thus reminds us that the political and cultural decolonization at this point in time and the art it catalyzed in Africa during the post-war period are important moments in global artistic modernism of the 20th century. Thank you.
So thank you very much for the invitation. On the periphery of the extensive exhibition grounds of the 1958 Brussels World's Fair stood the Turkish pavilion in all its modernism. And you see the atomium here, and here's the Turkish pavilion. With the construction of steel and glass, the Turkish Republic represented itself architecturally in a kind of international style, which, at least since the early 1950s and the country's economic opening to the United States, dominated contemporary architecture. Buildings such as the Hilton Hotel in Istanbul, erected between 1952 and 1955 by Sedat Hakkı Eldem in association with the American architects Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, set an example for Turkish building culture. More and more public buildings were oriented toward a functional style, were based on fundamental geometric forms and exhibited facades developed upon grid structures. Terraces, the emphasis on the horizontal axis, structures elevated on stilts, characterized tourism-related and commercial buildings as new types of constructions. Against the backdrop of contemporary building culture in Turkey, it seemed only natural for a national building erected abroad, such as the Expo 58 Pavilion, to follow this functional aesthetic. The theme of the Brussels Expo, the first World's Fair to be held after the end of World War II, was technology in the service of mankind, human progress through technological progress. The future technologies of space travel and nuclear power in particular were presented in a manner appealing to the public, the latter as the emblem of the exposition in the form of the atomium, which constituted the center of the exposition grounds and allegorized the peaceful use of atomic energy. Although technological optimism and the belief in progress were central motives of the Expo 58, history and tradition were also among the important general themes in the representation of the World's Fair. In the section Belgique Joyeuse, for example, the historic district of a Belgian town was displayed, you see it on the right, and formulated as a look back into the country's own history and culture. According to the rhetoric of the exhibition, from this perspective, tradition and modernity are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but the contrary. Upon the humus of their own cultural history, which had not been destroyed even by the aggressive Second World War, new and promising developments could sprout. With regard to all of the nations participating in the Expo, the question of how they had reacted to the Expo's thematic direction was raised. How had future designs and national representations, tradition and the present, been placed in relation to one another in the various pavilions? In Unité 11, located next to pavilions of Monaco, of Spain and Great Britain, the Turkish pavilion, with its curtain wall construction schematic, followed the dictum of an engineered and functional present. The architects Utarit Ezgi, Mulis Türkmen and Hamdi Şemsoy, who had won the national competition in 1956, designed a temporary structure composed of two building sections, whereby the glass hall at the right was reserved for the exhibition, while the smaller building housed a restaurant and a cafe. The buildings were conceived as an aluminium structure with a flat roof, glass front, glass and teak veneers, and a rigid grid-like appearance in keeping with contemporary American architecture. Building by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe and Frank Lloyd Wright had become popular in Turkey through a special edition of the influential journal L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui on architecture in the United States. With this aesthetic turn toward a Western contemporary architectural language, the Turkish pavilion explicitly positioned itself in a Western context. Similarly, modernist construction programs could also be seen in the pavilions of, for example, Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Portugal, all of which were constructed in a path of a functional style. At the same time, the Turkish pavilion clearly set itself apart from other exhibition buildings by non-Western participants who, in an act of maybe self-exotification, articulated architectural references to their own building traditions. These included, for example, the Iranian pavilion and the contributions from Cambodia, the Philippines, and Thailand. While the exterior of the Turkish pavilion at the Expo 1958 demonstratively attempted to stand shoulder to shoulder with the international modern style, inside the buildings, a national presentation reaching far back into Turkish tradition and culture unfolded with the exposition of traditional crafts, a retrospective of they called it history of civilization of Asia Minor, and the culinary direction of the restaurant and cafe. However, how were contemporary artworks selected for the building integrated into the pavilion's aesthetic and cultural political concept? What did the commissioners of the pavilion, Muniz Faik Ozansoy and Doğan Türkmen, select? In the Turkish pavilion at the Brussels World's Fair of 1958, the artists İlhan Koman and Bedri Rahmi Eyüboğlu represented the major currents in contemporary Turkish art. And you see a work of İlhan Koman here at the left side, and this is a work, a mosaic wall by Bedri Rahmi Eyüboğlu. After successfully earning his degree from the Academy of Fine Arts in Istanbul in 1947, Koman received a scholarship from the Turkish Ministry of Education to study in Paris for several years. During this time, he was particularly impressed by the sculptures of Auguste Rodin. After returning to Turkey in 1951, he took on a position as an assistant at the Academy of Fine Arts. This short biographical digression is especially important because even in the Ottoman Empire and later in the Turkish Republic, it was common for particularly gifted students to be sent abroad to Western countries. For artists and architects, Paris and Berlin were especially favored cities. Once back in Turkey, many of them were offered assistantships or professional positions so they could pass along the knowledge they gained in the West to the next generation. Thus, many artists in Turkey in the 1950s who would go on to shape the country's contemporary art already stood in close communication with, in particular, French artists and Western art history very early in their creative careers. They visited museums in the West. For Common, for example, the Mesopotamian and Egyptian collections in the Louvre were especially eye-opening, how he wrote. While Common had primarily worked figuratively until the mid-1950s, he now turned toward abstraction. Characteristic of the following phase of his work are experiments with metal. He worked with metal in its various aggregate states. Cracks that occurred during the melting process were creatively integrated into the sculptures. He was also interested in the material characteristics of his mediums. He handled and translated wood differently into amorphous forms that he did iron, for example, which, in an analysis of geometric figures, he constructed into volumetric formations. The Untitled irons created between 1956 and 1965, Coman speaks of his Iron Age, which also include the pylon for the Expo building, were shaped by Coman practically by force. The unruly hard materiality had a direct effect on the creative process and was expressed in rigid and vertically stretching sculptures, such as the tower for the Turkish pavilion and the bulky sculpture Marche et Barbarie. It's here, which seemed like the deconstruction or destruction of the Ottomium in Brussels, but was a deformed Ottoman window. These works expose the fact that Coman was intensely concerned with the relationship between space and sculpture, and that the spaces between were just as relevant as the material components of the work. Coman's tall, abstract, untitled sculpture for the Turkish Pavilion of 1958, a 30-meter high tower out of steel to which aluminium and plastic elements were attached, marked the stairway to the restaurant on the second floor of the building. Sculptures similar to this one, which is to be understood as a kind of advertising pylon for the building, can also be found at other pavilions at the 1958 World's Fair, such as the Pavilion des Industries Alimentaires, the Palais du Congo Belge et du Rwanda Urundi, and finally in the form of a large M at the Pavillon du Monaco, located directly next to the Turkish pavilion. The pylon's verticality, visible from afar, was intended to accentuate the predominantly horizontal pavilions, which as a result were difficult to see from a distance. Throughout his entire artistic career, Coman was concerned with the interplay of art and architecture. This is also evident in his interest in furniture design. In 1955, Coman, along with 3 fellow artists, founded the design firma Karametal, translatable as black metal, in Istanbul Şişli, and produced metal chairs and other small pieces of furniture. Karametal produced the chairs for the cafe in the Turkish pavilion, which meant Coman was represented there not only as a sculptor, but as a designer as well. On the other hand, Coman's sculpture Hittite Sun Course can be interpreted as a political turn toward a Turkish cultural history. Since the early 1930s, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk invested in a rewriting of Turkish history. According to the historical and cultural understanding of the Kemalists, all of the peoples and tribes that had settled on the Anatolian central area of Turkey, including the Sumerians and the Hittites, were retrospectively declared original Turks. The section, Crossroad of Civilization, in the exhibition hall of the Turkish Pavilion of 1958 was also intended to expose these Anatolian civilizations as being part of Turkish cultural history. Coman's Hittite Sun Course, displayed here, is an adaptation of Hittite ritualistic artifacts in the modern sculpture of the 1950s. It evidently did not seem to be a contradiction that, in one exhibition, an artist like Coman ventured to represent himself as an abstract sculptor, a designer, and a tradition-conscious artist. The second Turkish artist prominently represented in Brussels was the painter Bedri Rahmi Eyüboğlu, who designed a wall mosaic. His Turkish women in traditional village dresses and the suggestion of Anatolian patterns referring to regional crafts such as kilim weaving show a focus on national and regional themes and vernacular traditions. At the same time, the women, the fishermen, animals, mountains, and trees are strongly stylized and abstracted, and, as such, are depicted in a less realistic, less naturalistic style. As an artist born in 1913, Eyüboğlu's artistic socialization took place during the presidency of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, who, since the founding of the Turkish Republic in 1923, advocated an ideology encompassing art, economics, law, and politics with his political program of Kemalism, along with modernism, inkılapçılık, which propagated a turn toward Western culture. The principles of Kemalism also included Turkism, which sought the basis for a new secular identity in the country's own genuine Turkish traditions. Thereby, Turkish should not be viewed as identical to Ottoman. Ataturk developed a special passion for village culture as the cradle of Turkish culture, which manifested itself in the establishment of village institutions, köy enstitüleri, as well as in research on Turkish folklore music, for example. Eyüboğlu's affinity for village culture can be seen not only in the motives of many of his works, but also in texts he dedicated to the village as the nucleus of cultural creation and to vernacular art in its various forms, from dance to textile art. Eyüboğlu's approximately 50-meter wide by 2-meter high colorful wall mosaic out of pieces of stone and glass, which covered a total of 227 square meters, was a decisive part of the exhibition's architecture. Not only did it join the two parts of the Turkish pavilion with one another, you see it here, it could also be seen from both inside and out. Thus, the wall mosaic, as seen from the outside, was a piece of the architecture, here from the outside. Seen from the inside, however, it was its own exhibit and thus readable as an exposed artwork. Since as early as the mid-1940s, Eyüboğlu, a painter, created mural paintings and wall mosaics in collaboration with architects such as Paul Bonatz, for example. Eyüboğlu furnished Bonatz's opera house in Ankara with mosaics featuring Akkadian landscapes, which as a result are oriented in terms of motive more toward antique traditions. For Eyüboğlu, along with contemporary mosaics, for example, Fernand Léger's mosaic for the crypt of the American Memorial in Bastogne, the mosaics of the Hagia Sophia, and the Kora Museum, which could be studied in person in Istanbul, were of particular importance. Nevertheless, in spite of the Anatolian motives, the Turkish critique of the pavilion indeed struggled against the mosaic techniques employed by Eyüboğlu because they were not, as they wrote, characteristic for Turkish art or cultural history, but referred to the Mesopotamian, Egyptian, or Byzantine empires. Eyüboğlu's mosaic, along with other artworks of from this period, is characterized by methods of sampling and connecting. In an unconventional manner, the artist synthesizes Anatolian motifs, the interpretation, for example, of Hittite excavation finds and pre-Islamic artifacts, archaic techniques such as mosaic, and a modern formal vocabulary. As a result, the main themes of tradition and modernity, between which many Turkish artists oscillate, condense in Eyüboğlu's work, whereby it is not about an either-or, but about an integration of the two. Thus, contemporary Turkish art production stood in contrast to the dominant theological principle in Western art historiography in the 1950s of a narrative of progress from tradition toward modernity, from figuration toward abstraction. The art and architecture of Turkey's contribution to the Expo 1958 in Brussels exemplify the complex and complicated relationship between tradition and modernity, the global and the local. The Expo 1958 in Brussels was preceded by two large international art events. In 1956, the Venice Biennale, and in 1957, the fourth Sao Paulo Biennale. In both of these instances, Turkey sent their artists as cultural ambassadors. The year 1956 marked Turkey's first participation in the Venice Art Biennale. In Hall 54 of the main exhibition building, 17 painters and 6 sculptors associated with the Academy of Fine Arts of Istanbul were represented. In a text for the exposition catalogue, the commissioner of Turkey's contribution, the painter and academy professor Sabri Berkel, referred to 2 tendencies in contemporary art production in Turkey: the turn toward an international formal vocabulary of abstraction and the relevance of local traditions as a motive in subject selection, formal vocabulary, and aesthetics. It is telling that once again, together with 4 other artists, Eyüboğlu and Koman represented Turkey's contribution at the 4th Sao Paulo Biennale in 1957. Here, too, central tendencies of contemporary painting and sculpture took a prominent stance: abstraction and figuration, regionalism and internationalism. The paintings Eyüboğlu's contributed to this exhibition once again combine a motivic examination of Anatolian culture in Turkey as well as an abstracted figural conception. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for your very interesting panel. I think the problem we are talking about is to speak about local traditions, modernism and its counterparts. And I have a question to Mr. Okeke-Agulu regarding natural synthesis. There also have to be, I think there have been battles and discussions about natural synthesis and its relation to negritude. Perhaps you could talk a little bit, tell us a little bit about these political, ideological contexts in which natural synthesis has been based.
Well, the ideologue or maybe the philosopher, if you will, of the art society is Okeke, and that's why I decided to talk specifically about his work. And in outlining the program of the art society, he did refer to the work of the negritude poets and the politics of Kwame Nkrumah, his Pan-Africanism, and so forth. And so, to a certain extent, the political ambitions of Pan-Africanism, Nkrumah's version of it, which was based on his vision at the time of Ghanaian independence, that Ghana will not be independent until the rest of the continent became independent. So he was mapping an African independence program beyond that of Ghana. And so for artists in Nigeria, young artists from Nigeria, such as Uche Okeke and his generation, this was an important moment where they were looking not just at the question of Nigerian independence, which was about to happen, because these things take time, and it had been scheduled to happen in 1960. So they were looking towards the attainment of independence. But in terms of what became the later critique of negritude, this was not part of what they were thinking about. They were more interested in the fact that negritude was its affirmative project of reclamation, of self-assertion. This was what was important to them as young artists in Nigeria. Now, on the other hand, you had the more local context for the work that they did was the training that they were receiving in Zaria, which is, most of their teachers were from England, and as I mentioned yesterday, the program was modeled after that of the Slade. But you also had a previous generation of artists who went to train overseas, came back, someone like I know, Nabolu, who was basically painting figurative portraiture. And this was something they did not quite appreciate. They didn't think that it reflected, the period that they were, looking towards independence, because the form that he was projecting in his painting did not reflect that. So there was a confrontation with this older generation of artists. On the other hand, they were also engaged with the kind of aesthetics, the kinds of art that they were being presented and taught in art school. So there were different points that they were engaged with at the time. And what was very important to them was, as I mentioned, not a rejection of any of these elements, but a way of, and this is where the idea of natural synthesis, which was his theory, came about, that the artist had to engage with all these multiple sources, and but at the same time centered on the reclamation of traditional art forms as a resource, not a continuation of that tradition, but as one of the possible resources for their formal experiments, as a way to assert their own autonomous art form.
My question is for Sam. Sam, I see something very similar happening in India, where the post-war, immediate post-war, post-independence art world, and especially its cosmopolitan dimension, is not always very easily dealt with. And I wanted to push you a little bit on the political reasons for the elision that you ended with. Why? And can you tell us more about it?
Why I ended my presentation the way I ended it?
No. Why? Surely there's a short-sightedness of the curators that you outlined, but I assume that this is happening in a broader context and that there are more, deeper reasons for that. Can you tell us more about it?
Well, I think I don't want to come across as if I'm critiquing that particular exhibition or, but in my own practice, and my colleague Till Felrath, with whom we started Artery Oriented a few years ago, one of the things that we try to do is always find a different framework through which we kind of construct certain curatorial narratives when working with contemporary artists. And as we all know, and this is one of the main reasons why we're here, there's always this assumption that certain places have always been on the periphery of artistic production, and they have started becoming more integrated with international art practices more recently, with the contemporary art. So one of the things that I find fascinating is to kind of look back and unlock important moments in the history or in the manifestation of different types of modernities, specifically in the area that I'm interested in order to see, certain parallelisms or precedents to what is happening now, and try to find a mirror or try to find a backdrop that could be more interesting and less kind of stuck with this polarization or this dichotomy of East-West, but actually look internally or locally and see what was happening back then and how does that resonate today or not. Are we aware of what happened before? And how can we dialogue with it or learn from it or negate it? So it's more an approach to how do you frame a certain curatorial construct while working with contemporary art and artists without having to only look at the more recent kind of horizontal approach, but kind of go back. And so I don't know if I answered your question, but
Okay, thanks very much for all these papers. I just want to make a suggestion and see if anyone would like to comment on it, along the lines of our collective effort to identify processes a little bit more precisely and develop languages that are different from the ones we've inherited from the Westernist structure. One of the great terms that my teacher Bernard Smith in Australia developed was iconomorphism, iconomorphic, which Australian artists and I think nearly everyone we're speaking about really concentrated on imagery or icons that could change, that could be changed, that could morph into some other icon, not stay fixed or just be repeated or put alongside each other, but actually in their interaction change into something else and change the whole relationship that's operating. And during today's papers, I've thought of a variation of that, because in a sense, many of the artists who are being looked at here are not just doing that in a singular way, but they're trying to do it across time, through traditions and modernities, and across spaces, different parts of the world. And they're also trying to do it under the heading of frameworks like Pan-Africanism or negritude, or the Arabic. There's a number of them. So here's a term: trans-iconomorphic approaches, trans-iconomorphism, something, not an ism, it's not a style thing, but something that also picks up the history out of surrealism that's so strong through all of this. But really this transformatory iconomorphic work. So it's just a suggestion for our discussion. Any comments I welcome, but I don't think we've got a lot of time.
It's a good suggestion, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wouldn't. Yeah.
I have a question. Amongst your 4 papers, there seem to be 2 distinct tracks that each of the papers address. One could be called a salvage paradigm, sort of looking back to the past to somehow reclaim something, and out of that, salvage, do something new. And this has to do with the artist's relationship to tradition and the past, to say their own inherited traditions. On the second side is what I would call belatedness, the engagement with belatedness. And I wonder, when an artist in the 50s is looking at the Fauves, looking at Impressionists, what does that really say about their engagement with, modernism and modernity? It's for all 4 of you. Anyone can take it on.
Well, I actually really do not like that term belatedness, because it's very problematic. I mean, anyone who's been to the Picasso Museum will see that he's done Impressionism too. So that's, to me, it's just this, the artist did it as an academic exercise. I think in art school today you still teach all these styles, just sort of, for knowledge of it. In terms of belatedness, this was happening in parallels. Maybe what Sam was talking about was happening at the same time, so that was very contemporary. And when Jawad Salim was studying at the Slade School, or in Paris or in Italy, although that didn't really affect him very much because it was a very short time, he was very much engaged with what was happening. I mean, there's a story of him even trying to go meet with Picasso, but then he sort of he gets there and he's too shy and doesn't want to meet with him because he doesn't know what to say to him, and so he leaves. But he was, in many ways, it's a contemporary understanding. To Jawad Salim, it was that problematic that, the past, the present, the modern, the local, that was modern art. His understanding of that problematic is how he understood modern art. So I'm not sure, I'm answering your question, but I just really, not comfortable answering that question.
I would say that as artists, what was important to this generation was the claiming of all possible sources,
Right.
as artists. Not simply a matter of, well, this is European, and so we don't and shouldn't touch this material. And this is against the background of the colonial education. If you look at the schools that were established across the continent, they were not taught modern art. They were not taught about Picasso. They were not taught even about Impressionism. If you look at the curriculum, it was more, the more predominant material from the West was medieval art. And if you read the writings of Kenneth Murray, who wrote most of the stuff among this generation of teachers, he made a strong argument why the only thing that was worthwhile to teach these young African artists was medieval art, because it was close to religion. And their own ancestral work is, art is about religion. And so it was even a radical gesture, and this is why I kept insisting that this was extracurricular work that they were doing outside of what they were learning in school, to even learn about Picasso. If you look at the diaries of Uche Okeke, he was reading every possible book that was published on modern art. And the library at the time was very good at it. So for them, it was important that they are looking at every possible sources from wherever, including that of their ancestors, which was also denied them. So for them, even the idea that someone like him is looking at traditional Uli wall painting was in itself a radical gesture, because that also was not being taught to them. So for these artists, looking towards various traditions of modern art and various traditions of African art were things that their training as artists did not provide to them. So rather than think of it in terms of their belatedness, it's the way that artists work. They look to what is already existing. In other words, they look to the past in order to construct the present and the future of their work. So that if we think of this idea of the avant-garde, they became avant-garde because they were dealing with tradition, however imagined those traditions were, and commenting and meditating on what those traditions meant as they fashioned their work in the present.
And I would also add that in the case of the Art and Liberty group, they even took it further. They were completely opposed to looking back at their own local tradition. They weren't even looking at ancient Egypt or Egyptian motifs or hieroglyphics or pharaonic sculpture. By the same token, they were criticizing the academic training that some of the earlier artists from the previous generation kind of imitated blindly when they went to Europe and came back. So they were looking at surrealism, or a negotiation, I like that term, a negotiation of surrealism as a means of breaking free from all these frames. So in a sense, maybe it's not a problem of belatedness, who did it first or who did it later. It's more a question of framing. How were these artists received at the time? How were they written about? And what is fascinating about the Art and Liberty group is that they were not only seeking a way out through the art that they were creating themselves, they were seeking a way out through critiquing and destroying the traditional exhibition structure. So they were really critiquing the mechanisms of visual display and literary display through which artists have been categorized or framed. So to give you the example of Mahmoud Mukhtar, who precedes them, and by the way, all these artists are currently on show in Munich. We have an exhibition at the Egyptian Museum comprising of interventions with the historical collection called Tea with Nefertiti, or Nofretete Tete Atete, that Till and I curated. You're most welcome to go and see the surrealists of Egypt from the 30s and the 40s and others. So Mahmoud Mukhtar, when he had his show in 1930 in Paris at Galerie Bernheim Jeanne, he was labeled, the catalog of the exhibition was Egyptian Contemporary Art, Mahmoud Mukhtar. Picasso was showing at the same gallery, and it was never called Spanish Contemporary Art. And then the introduction of the catalog was written by the curator from the Ghodam Museum, and the whole rhetoric was about the 1001 Nights. He had nothing to do with the 1001 Nights. They weren't even set in, and the fact that he's the first Egyptian sculptor to, resurrect Egyptian historical greatness. So I don't know if Mukhtar himself he was definitely not thinking around these terms. He probably found himself coerced by his country to become the national hero, and the younger generation were totally rejecting all these labels. And in a sense, we see this happening in a lot of shows today that create surveys of African artists or Egyptian artists, or a lot of curators do that subconsciously or consciously. And it's important to find different open up the discussion beyond these redundant, worn-out labels and platforms of presentation to allow the artists to shine and to show what they're doing as individual creative beings like they were all the time.
And I can just add a tiny little bit that I think that for artists like Agulu, it was important that the past, present, and future could fall in one, and that you always try to expand categories and to try new things. And so I try to had one term like sampling or connecting things, and to intermingle and with very different things which could lay in the past or in the present, in the West or in their own countries. And I think for someone like Agulu, the local and vernacular was more important than the national. This is, I don't know how what do you think about it, about the relation between the local and the national?
Yeah, I think it's different moments at different times. The 1950s in Baghdad, the national was important because that's the first time they have a national. So, they need to understand it, imagine it, and before they can reject it. So while, at that time, Egypt has a very different history. Africa has a very different post-colonial history than Iraq. So I think, it's, and then, you have Turkey with Ataturk is again a different historical past. So I think that has a lot to do with it. The context of the historical past of each one of these countries. I mean, we all talk about the non-Western, and we all can find parallels in the presentations in Brazil or the other presentations in the past 2 days. But clearly, each one does have its own sort of context of development that makes it very different. For Jawad Salim, he had no one to reject. There was nothing to reject art historically before him. So he was writing a canon, essentially. So, it was just a new imagination that they were forming.
I know there are a few other questions, but my alarm went off about 5 minutes ago, and we have passed our closing time. A quick reminder about the photograph in the front steps, and also that we are moving to Zeddy for the next panel. So wrapping up very quickly, please give a big hand to our panelists.